And so here's where we're going to start. We're understanding first that the church is a key part of God's plan. See, after Jesus rose to heaven, essentially the next thing that happens is the start of what we call the early church. And following the Gospels is the book of Acts. And if you don't know, the book of Acts is like a history book of the first 3 decades of the church. So the book of Acts was written by a man named Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, right? Okay, so, and he starts the second book with this. It says, "In my first book, I told you, Theophilus, about everything Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven after giving his chosen apostles further instruction through his Holy Spirit." So the Gospel of Luke is what Jesus began, and then the book of Acts is about what Jesus is going to continue to do through his apostles that he has chosen. And what's interesting about this word church is that its Greek word it's called ecclesia. Can you guys say that? Ecclesia. It's a little bit of a tongue twister, but it just means, or is translated to the called out ones. So the book of Acts is about how Jesus is going to work through the church. But at this point, the called out ones, or the church, was mainly the 12 disciples. So now all of this stuff had just happened that we read about in the Gospels, right? Their world was spinning upside down. Like imagine witnessing the resurrection and then walking around with Jesus, who you just watched die, like it's totally normal. Like, no, that is not normal. If you die, you're not supposed to be walking around 3 days later. You're supposed to be dead, right? No, they weren't supposed to be with him. So of course, the disciples had questions, like, I have questions, and I know the rest of the story, let alone what they were experiencing in that time. So then in verse 6 of Acts 1, they start asking some of these questions. And then they say, "So when the apostles were with Jesus, they kept asking him, 'Lord, has the time come for you to free Israel and restore our kingdom?' He replied, 'The Father alone has the authority to set these dates and times, and they are not for you to know. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth.' After this, he was taken up into the cloud while they were watching, and they could no longer see him." So Jesus told them that he's not going to tell them how and when everything is going to play out and what it's going to look like. But he promises them that they will receive power by the Holy Spirit and to be his witnesses. And listen to this, to the ends of the earth. That is a big job for men with very ordinary jobs, right? So when God knew that they would need divine strength and empowerment, now when Jesus was no longer going to be with them, he gave them the Holy Spirit. It was through the Spirit's guidance and strength every step of the way that they were able to fulfill their calling from the instructions that they had been given to spread the kingdom. And we know this happens. We know that they were successful and fulfilled what they had been called to do because Luke writes about the growth and the movement and development of the church in Acts 2. So Peter had been giving this teaching to a crowd, and then about what had happened when the Holy Spirit came upon the anointed people. And it ended up being one of the first messages or teachings of the Spirit-empowered church that caused this great growth. Because we read this, it says, "Then Peter continued preaching for a long time, strongly urging all his listeners, 'Save yourselves from this crooked generation.' Those who believed what Peter said were baptized and added to the church that day, about 3,000 in all." 3,000 people were added and baptized. 3,000 people saw what the Holy Spirit was doing through the disciples, heard what God had done and told them, and then responded by committing their lives to following him. And then this is what that looked like for them. In verse 42 of Acts 2, it says, "All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them, And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all the believers met together in a place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. So this growing group of followers, this called out ones, the 3,000, this church was marked and characterized by commitment to teaching and truth, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and prayer. They shared everything that they had, supported one another with the supernatural generosity, and then they continued to fulfill the initial call that was given to the church to be witnesses and to spread the kingdom further to more and more people. This is such a cool but little glimpse into the growth and movement that people of the early church experienced. From Luke to Acts, we see this growth and spread of the kingdom as it started with the one, that being Jesus. We see that in Luke 3. And then to the 12 disciples that he called to follow him in Luke 9. And then after Jesus sent out the appointed, so those 12, he appointed another 72 and then sent them out to spread the kingdom. And then we get to what we just read in Acts 2, where thousands were added, and it continued to grow daily. There were so many things within this history and movement of the early church that we need to pay attention to.